Stories from the home front bright, keeping victory shining light on the Victory Homefront.
Last week, I celebrated a milestone birthday, which is why you didn't see an episode last week. But it did kind of open the door for me to really look into what I could have done during the wartime. If I had been living in World War II at the age that I am, what would I have been able to do? Or what would have been open for me to do to serve and to support the war effort? I know what I would have wanted to do. I would have wanted to enlist. But at my age, I would not have been able to, most likely. In a lot of the enlistment area, I am just simply too old. And in one branch, I am right on the cusp. But we're going to get into that. Most women who served, they were younger. And we're going to go through several of the branches and we're going to see what exactly a woman could do for the wartime effort based on their age, their marital status, and whether or not they have children. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of On the Victory Homefront. Today, again, we are going to be talking about age, family, and service, the boundaries placed on women in World War II. Now, eligibility during World War II, it wasn't informal, and it came down to specific enforceable factors: age, marital status, dependent children, and the specific branch where you wanted to enlist. It was different from branch to branch, but it all was also very similar. So these rules, it shaped not just opportunity, but access. So we're going to first start with the WAC, which is the Women's Army Corps. And the Women's Army Corps was one of the primary paths for women to serve in uniform. And this is where details really start to matter. The minimum age was 20 to 21, and the upper age limit eventually extended to about 50 years old. And there was a physical and mental fitness. You had to be a U.S. citizen. So yes, at 50, because that's what I am now, I could have enlisted into the WAC. However, having my age that it is, there were still restrictions. I was not an automatic shoo-in because they were getting plenty of women that would have been half my age. So most recruitments were significantly younger. So while it's not impossible for me to serve, it was very uncommon. Now, women in the WAC could not have dependent children under 18. So you could not be a mother if you were going to serve with the WACs. And that was a rule that was consistent and enforced. So married women, yes, you could join the WACs, no children. Then you were eligible. Married, no children, good. You're good to go in a certain age bracket. Let's add that. Married women or unmarried women with dependent children, you were not eligible. So marriage was not the barrier, but motherhood definitely was. And that shaped who could and could not serve with the WACs. Now we're going to jump into the waves, which is where I probably would have joined, at least who I am today. I probably would have joined the waves. I think had I been half the age that I am and was, it was World War II, I probably would have gone to the WACs. But now I have a soft spot for the waves. So the waves program, which was the Navy, it also followed an identical policy to the WACs. Now, their age was more restrictive. It was 20 to 36, generally where they were, and there were some later expansions as well. And education requirements depended on the role. But again, no dependent children because the Navy required full availability for service. Makes sense. And like the Army, it treated motherhood as a big no. It was incompatible for you to serve, but you could be married. And my great aunt actually was a wave, and she was married to my uncle, obviously, who was in the Army. And so there was a lot of jokes with the Army and the Navy. Just a little fun tidbit in there. Okay, so now we're going to go into the Marine Corps' Women's Reserve. And they also maintained the same standards. The age limits were similar to the waves, and there was physical and character screening. And again, women with dependent children were not eligible. So at this point, you can see there was a consistent pattern across the branches. Married was okay, no children, and there were age restrictions. The Coast Guard SPARS, it also followed the same structure. The women were typically in their 20s to mid 30s. And even though they had primarily stateside assignments, again, no dependent children were allowed. And this was across every major branch. It was the same boundary that existed. Now I'm going to look at the WASP. The WASP is the Women Air Force Service Pilots. And even though they weren't considered a military branch, they were considered a civilian group at the time. They also had restrictions, and they were even stricter because they had certain requirements. Because the WASPs were flying aircrafts. So they required an age roughly from 21 to 35. I'm saying roughly. And they must have had prior flight training. They also had very strong physical standards. But again, no dependent children. Even if you were the most qualified pilot at the time, you would not have been eligible had you had children. Now, nurses were a little bit more flexible, but not entirely. So it was a little different. The Army and Navy Nurse Corps required professional credentials, and it was critical from the start of the war. Married women could serve, especially early on, but again, having dependent children often limited or prevented acceptance. So even here, the same pressure point remained. So when you step back, you can see the pattern on what women were able to do or not do for the war efforts. So marriage was often allowed. Motherhood with dependent children was generally not allowed, and age limited both entry and likelihood of acceptance. This meant that many women, especially older women and mothers, were excluded from uniformed service, not by preference, but by design. But exclusion from the military did not mean exclusion from the war effort. It just meant redirection. Women, especially mothers, were heavily represented in factories, shipyards, aircraft production, clerical work, and these roles did not exclude women with children. In fact, those roles actually depended on those women. But with that being available to women with children, something you have to remember is that this work still required you to do your domestic responsibility. Working outside of the home did not replace domestic responsibility, it added to it. And so women were expected to work full shifts and maintain their households, raise their children, manage rationing and daily life. And there were some support systems that existed. I had mentioned it in a previous episode where this is really where child care came about, was during this time of World War II when women went to work. But it was limited. And so many women carried both roles at once. And they really relied on community, whether it was other family members or neighbors, to maybe help them with their children or anything along those lines. And you will see that reflected in wartime media, whether it's movies or magazines. It was really a community effort when the women were stepping up into these new areas that maybe they were not in before. Now, volunteer roles were more flexible, and it was still a way for you to support the war effort, but it was not completely unrestricted. Age was usually a less of a barrier, and children were not disqualifying, but it did shape what roles were realistic for you to be able to do. So, unlike the military, volunteer work was not centrally regulated the same way, and there were fewer eligibility rules, but there were still expectations, practical limits, and social boundaries. So, one would be the Red Cross, and it was one of the biggest outlets for women, maybe in my position. The American Red Cross was one of the main ways women contributed, and roles included sewing surgical dressings, rolling bandages, knitting garments for soldiers, hospital volunteering, canteen service, and there was without a doubt more along those lines. These are just some of the things that I'm mentioning. And even though there were restrictions, there were no formal upper age limits in most roles. Now, women of many ages participated, including older women, and mothers were absolutely included. But some roles, like overseas or hospital work, did require training, availability, and physical stamina. So, again, not legally excluded, but practically limited. Then there was the USO, which is the United Service Organizations. And the USO work included serving food and drinks to servicemen, hosting dances and social events, and providing recreation. And so their restrictions were heavily shaped by age and presentation. Younger women were often preferred for hostess roles and social interaction, where the older women were most likely to serve in the organizational or supervisory roles, which I'm not fully against being in a supervisor role. And children were not disqualifying, but it did limit availability for evening or long hour work. Then we have the civil defense. This is something that my grandparents actually did during the World War II years, and that included things like the air raid wardens and just any local support. So you're talking first aid volunteers and emergency response training. The restrictions for there did have some age and physical requirements, and they were a little bit more structured than the Red Cross. But women with children could still participate, and they were often done within their own communities. War bond drives and community work is another area where a lot of mothers contributed. So that included selling war bonds, organizing local events, church and school efforts, community drives, and there were virtually really no restrictions. It was highly flexible, and it was designed to fit around family life. Then we have stuff just right at your own doorstep, victory gardens and homefront support. Now, it's not always labeled as volunteer work, but it was absolutely a part of it because you were growing food, you were preserving food, supporting the rationing systems. And so there were no restrictions here. This was actually expected of everyone, especially women managing their households. So while military service had formal restrictions, and volunteer work had fewer rules but still followed social expectations, mothers were basically excluded from a lot of those things. They were excluded from the uniformed service, but yet they were still expected to contribute through volunteer and community work. So it's not that you couldn't serve, it's that you can serve in this way. And when you look across everything that we just spoke about, it's consistent assumption that a mother's primary responsibility remained at home despite the war going on. And the country needed women, but it placed boundaries on how far that participation could go based on really if you were a mother or not, and also your age. So when I return to that original question I had at the beginning of this episode, what would I have done at 50 during World War II? I think the more accurate question is, what would I have been allowed to do? And the answer is not what I would want to do. Age might have placed me at the edge, but family responsibility would have defined the outcome because I do have a dependent child. Granted, he's over 18, but he's still dependent on me. So if I had a dependent child or a dependent adult, as I do, I would have been heavily restricted to the kind of war work I could be allowed or able to do. And that would have determined my whole path. Now, when I envision myself during World War II, I'm 30. So I, without a doubt, would have been entering the uniformed service had I not had any children. But it just puts this into perspective. We do see a lot of what women were doing, but I don't think we really examine who was allowed to do that. And so a lot of women my age or in the same position that I am with a child or dependent person, the only thing that would have been available to me would be factory work, volunteer work, and of course, everything I would do at home, victory gardens, rationing, which was expected of everyone. Now, of course, there were a lot more ways to serve during World War II. I'm learning more every day, every week, and I just touched on some of the main ones that I think most people have heard of. But I do hope to really go into some unsung areas of maybe some ways that people served that you might not have heard about or really looked into or thought about. But that's for future episodes, which is why you should go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. I want to thank you all for joining me for this episode of On the Victory Homefront. Be sure to share with your friends and family and help my audience grow. Come back every week for a new episode, so do not miss it. You're going to want to hit that subscribe button. And until next time, my friends, remember that victory is in the everyday.